We typically treat policy decisions or municipal budgets or even just a mayor signing a bill with this expectation of total engineering level precision.
Right, yeah.
Like a city council votes, the ledger is balanced, and officials just sort of point to a spreadsheet and assume the physical world will neatly conform to the math on that page.
Which is a huge assumption.
Right. We love the idea that human governance can just be compartmentalized into nice, neat administrative buckets.
Yeah, the assumption is always that a policy remains a policy, that it exists purely in this realm of human abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment you apply an abstract fiscal mandate to physical infrastructure, that assumed precision it completely shatters.
It falls apart.
Exactly. You're suddenly dealing with thermodynamics, cellular biology, and these really complex ecological cascades. I mean, the physical world doesn't read the city council's budget.
It definitely does not. And that collision between abstract policy and physical reality is the absolute definition of muddy waters. So, welcome back to another deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are taking a massive stack of clinical biology data, economic theory, and just raw sociological history to answer one terrifying question for you. How does a signature on a piece of legislation cascade down to alter the covalent bonds in a glass of water, denature human enzymes, and breed lethal pathogens in a city's plumbing?
It's a phenomenal question, honestly, because we're fundamentally looking at the anatomy of systemic collapse.
Yeah.
We're tracing a straight line from municipal governance down to the molecular level and then scaling it all the way back up to global energy transitions.
To do this, we're weaving together some incredibly dense and, frankly, revealing sources for you today.
Yeah.
We are looking at the historical account of the Flint water crisis in Benjamin J. Pauly's Flint Fights Back.
Great book.
Yeah, really good. Plus, we're pulling macroeconomic theory from J. Midgenshaw's A Just Transition for All, and we're anchoring all of this with the structural biology from OpenStax' Biology 2E, some mammalian homeostasis principles from our Mammalogy texts, alongside clinical data from bacterial pathogens and superbugs.
Right. And what ties all of these really diverse sources together is this concept of boundaries, or rather the illusion of them.
Illusion, right.
Yeah, because we separate the politicians in one building, the chemists in a lab, and the wildlife conservationists out in the field. But an ecosystem, and by extension, a human body, operates as a single continuous feedback loop.
Right.
A chemical stressor introduced at the top level of municipal funding immediately translates into biological trauma at the cellular level.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the absolute ground zero for that kind of trauma. Let's get into the chemistry of a catastrophe, specifically focusing on the inciting incident documented in Flint Fights Back.
April 2014.
Exactly. April 25, 2014. The city of Flint, Michigan makes this administrative decision driven entirely by cost cutting. They sever their relationship with the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, which, supplied treated Lake Huron water, and switch their municipal water source to the raw Flint River.
Right. And from a purely spreadsheet-driven perspective, water is just a fungible asset.
It's just water.
It's exactly. Moving from one body of water to another seems like a simple logistical shift.
Right.
But from a biogeochemical standpoint, that switch was basically tantamount to dropping a bomb into the underground infrastructure.
Because it's not the same water.
Not at all. The Flint River is not Lake Huron. It has a vastly different dissolved solid profile, and most critically, an extraordinarily high chloride concentration.
And chlorides are aggressive, right? They actively seek out and degrade metals.
Very aggressive, yeah.
But the presence of chlorides in the river water wasn't even the fatal blow here. The true failure, the actual mechanism that triggered the entire crisis, was a deliberate omission at the treatment plant.
Right, the missing ingredient.
Yeah. The state operators failed to add corrosion control, specifically orthophosphates.
And that omission is the hinge upon which the entire public health disaster swings. I mean, orthophosphates are not a luxury additive. They are the fundamental defense mechanism of a municipal water grid. When you introduce them into the water supply, orthophosphate molecules travel through the distribution system and react with the interior walls of the metal pipes.
Okay.
They basically precipitate out of the water to form this dense, insoluble mineral film. We call it a passivation layer.
So this passivation layer is effectively a microscopic suit of armor, right? It coats the interior of the pipe so that the water flowing through it never actually makes physical contact with the raw underlying metal.
Precisely. You are artificially maintaining a chemical barrier, and the condition of the metal behind that barrier is vital context here.
Because it's old.
incredibly old.
Hmm.
Flint's subterranean infrastructure was ancient. We are talking about a grid that included an 1897 city ordinance explicitly mandating the use of lead service lines to connect homes to the main system.
Wow, 1897.
Yeah, so you had tens of thousands of aging lead pipes alongside galvanized iron just sitting underground for over a century.
And so when you stop feeding the system orthophosphates, that passivation layer doesn't just sit there, does it?
No, it degrades rapidly.
Right, because the highly corrosive, chloride-rich river water dissolved whatever protective mineral crust was left over from the Detroit water days. It exposed the raw, century-old lead directly to the flow of drinking water.
The physical infrastructure literally began to dissolve into the municipal water supply. Raw lead PEEB on the periodic table began leaching at an astonishing rate.
Which is terrifying.
And this is where the policy decision crosses the blood-brain barrier. Lead is a heavy metal and a profound systemic neurotoxin.
There's no safe level. Right.
Absolutely none. There is no biological mechanism in the human body designed to process it, which is why there is zero safe blood lead level, particularly for developing pediatric brains.
I really want to dig into the molecular mechanism of that toxicity for you listening, because this is where the biology sources provide such a horrifying clarity. Lead doesn't just indiscriminately destroy tissue.
No, it's much sneakier than that.
Right. It's insidious because it operates through molecular mimicry. At the atomic level, a lead ion shares a similar size and electrical charge to essential minerals that our biology desperately needs.
Most notably calcium. Carry 2 plus Phil.
Exactly, calcium.
And if we look at our mammalogy texts, calcium ions are the fundamental signaling currency of the mammalian nervous system. I mean, calcium is the trigger for almost every neurological event.
Right.
When an electrical action potential travels down a neuron and reaches the synaptic terminal, voltage-gating calcium channels open up. Calcium floods into the cell, and that influx is the specific signal that tells the neuron to release vesicles full of neurotransmitters across the synapse to communicate with the next cell.
It's the literal foundation of thought and muscle movement.
Emotional regulation, everything.
But because lead is such a convincing molecular imposter, the cellular machinery can't tell the difference, can it?
It cannot.
So a child drinks a glass of Flint River water, the lead is absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract, and it easily crosses the blood-brain barrier because the body just assumes, hey, we're importing calcium.
Right, and once it's inside, the lead forcefully hijacks those calcium channels.
It just takes over.
It does. It binds to the receptors with an even higher affinity than calcium, effectively blocking the calcium out. But lead doesn't trigger the proper release of neurotransmitters.
Because it's not calcium.
Right. It scrambles the signal. It either initiates erratic, spontaneous neurotransmitter release, or it shuts the channel down entirely.
Wow.
This is why the clinical outcomes in children are so devastating. You see irreversible cognitive deficits, severe drops in IQ, aggressive behavioral changes, and profound impulse control disorders.
Because the architecture of the brain is being miswired in real time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because a heavy metal is impersonating a vital nutrient.
And the breakdown goes even deeper than synaptic transmission. If we pull from OpenStack's Biology 2E, we have to look at how life maintains its structure through delicate chemical bonds, covalent, ionic, and hydrogen bonds.
Right, the foundations.
Yeah. Our biology is entirely dependent on proteins, specifically enzymes, maintaining a very precise three-dimensional folded shape to do their jobs.
The geometry of an enzyme literally dictates its function. Those intricate folds are held together by relatively weak hydrogen bonds, which are highly sensitive to their environment.
Very sensitive.
Enzymes evolved to operate within a very strict, narrow pH range. When highly corrosive water or heavy metal toxicity alters the pH of the cellular environment, those hydrogen bonds begin to break.
The protein literally unfolds. It denatures.
It loses its structural integrity. And once an enzyme denatures, the active site where it catalyzes chemical reactions, it's destroyed.
So the cell just stops working.
The cellular metabolic pathways simply halt. The cells lose their ability to generate ATP, to repair DNA, to clear out toxins. Yeah. So a fiscal decision to avoid purchasing orthophosphates directly results in the mass denaturing of pediatric enzymes.
See, I have to play devil's advocate here, though, because the sheer mechanics of this are just baffling to me.
How so?
Well, we're talking about highly trained plant operators. The chemistry of corrosion, the function of orthophosphates, the neurotoxicity of lead mint. None of this is new or experimental science.
Oh, not at all. It's basic water treatment.
Right. If I buy a raw cast iron skillet, I know I can't cook an egg on it without seasoning it first, or the egg will just chemically bond to the bare metal and burn.
It's a great analogy.
So how does a municipal water treatment facility look at unseasoned pipes and highly variable raw river water and decide to just flip the switch without, like, extensive treatability studies?
Well, the plant operators were thrust into an unprecedented and largely impossible operational scenario
Because of the budget.
because of the budget and the timeline. For decades, they'd merely been a pass-through facility for highly treated, stable water from Detroit. Suddenly, under intense political pressure to meet the emergency manager's austerity timeline, they were ordered to fully treat raw river water.
Without the right prep.
Exactly. Standard protocol dictates extensive treatability studies, sometimes lasting over a year, to determine the exact chemical dosing required for a new water source.
And they just skipped that.
Those studies were largely bypassed, yeah.
Yeah, we're just improvising on a municipal scale. I mean, I read they started dumping ferric chloride into the water to help coagulate and settle out the organic matter from the river.
Which only exponentially increased the chloride ratio.
Right. It drove the corrosivity even higher. But the real failure seems to lie with the regulatory body. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, the MDEQ, they were fully aware the plant wasn't using corrosion control. Why didn't the regulators pull the emergency brake?
The MDEQ exploited a highly technical and frankly dangerous interpretation of the federal lead and copper rule.
A loophole.
Basically, they argued that because Flint was utilizing a quote-unquote new water source, the system was required to undergo 2 consecutive 6-month testing periods to gather data before the agency could officially determine whether corrosion control was even mathematically necessary.
Are you kidding me? They used the entire population of the city as human guinea pigs for a year to see if the pipes would dissolve, rather than just proactively protecting them.
That's exactly what the data collection period amounted to. Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, and terrifying. Because we've been focused heavily on the metallurgical and chemical breakdown, right? The lead, the chlorides, the denaturing enzyme.
The inorganic side.
Exactly. But when a physical environment degrades, biology rushes in to fill the void. The infrastructure breakdown didn't just leach metal, it created a microscopic buffet for pathogens.
The systemic failure cascade.
Right. It transformed the municipal water grid into a massive subterranean bioreactor.
It did. Because when the corrosive river water attacked those aging iron mains, massive amounts of iron were sheared off and suspended in the water column.
Okay, so the water is full of iron.
Right. Now, municipal water is usually treated with chlorine to kill bacteria and prevent biological growth in the miles of dark, stagnant pipes under a city.
Sure.
But chlorine is highly reactive.
So it reacted with the raw iron. The iron essentially neutralized the city's disinfectant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The suspended iron chemically bonded with the free chlorine, rapidly depleting the chlorine residuals in the water supply.
Wow.
And the moment that residual chlorine drops below a critical threshold, the water ceases to be sterile. It becomes an incredibly hospitable environment for opportunistic pathogens.
Yeah.
Most notably, Legionella pneumophila.
Which is the bacterium responsible for Legionnaire's disease.
You got it.
Yeah.
Legionella is a naturally occurring waterborne pathogen, but it thrives in warm, stagnant, unchlorinated water, particularly where it can feed on iron and form complex biofilms inside deteriorating pipes.
So the Flint water grid basically became an incubator.
A massive one. When residents turned on their showers, the hot water aerosolized the Legionella bacteria.
Oh, so they were breathing it in.
The residents inhaled that contaminated vapor deep into their lungs, bypassing the digestive system entirely. And that resulted in an aggressive necrotizing pneumonia.
The numbers from the clinical data on this are just devastating. I mean, over 80 confirmed cases and at least 12 deaths directly linked to the water switch.
That we know of.
Right, that we know of. So an administrative policy strips the passivation layer, which leaches the iron, which destroys the chlorine, which breeds the Legionella, which suffocates the residents. It is a flawless, unbroken chain of causality from the ledger to the lung.
It really is. And if we contextualize this using our clinical data on bacterial pathogens and superbugs, we can see how this methodology of systemic infiltration perfectly mirrors other catastrophic biological threats.
Okay, let's look at those mechanisms.
Whether a system is breached by an infrastructural failure, like in Flint, or an aggressive microscopic organism, the blueprint of the attack is remarkably similar.
Understanding how pathogens dismantle a host clarifies just how fragile our homeostasis really is. Let's look at botulism, for instance.
A classic example.
Right. Much like lead, the botulinum toxin is a profound neurotoxin, but its method of dismantling a nervous system is entirely different.
Lead relies on molecular mimicry to slip through channels. Botulinum toxin acts more like a microscopic saboteur equipped with molecular explosives.
Okay, I like that visual.
It specifically targets the presynaptic terminals of the neuromuscular junction. That's the literal chemical bridge where a motor neuron interfaces with a muscle fiber.
So the electrical signal comes from the brain, hits the end of the nerve, and needs to cross that physical gap to tell the muscle to contract. How does the botulinum toxin cut that communication line?
The toxin is composed of a heavy chain and a light chain. The heavy chain binds to the neuron and allows the toxin to be absorbed inside.
Like a Trojan horse.
Exactly. Once inside, the light chain detaches and acts as an incredibly precise protease, basically a pair of molecular scissors.
Okay.
It actively seeks out and cleaves snare proteins.
And what do those do?
Snare proteins are the vital docking mechanisms that allow neurotransmitter-filled vesicles, specifically acetylcholine, to fuse with the cell membrane and release their contents into the synapse.
Oh, wow. So if the snare proteins are sliced to pieces, the vesicles just pile up inside the neuron, the acetylcholine can't deploy.
The signal is completely trapped. The muscle fiber never receives the chemical instruction to contract, resulting in symmetric flaccid paralysis.
The muscles simply go limp.
And if that paralysis descends to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles of the chest, the mechanical action of breathing ceases. Without immediate mechanical ventilation and antitoxin administration, the host suffocates.
It's widely regarded as one of the most acutely lethal biological substances on Earth, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And the clinical text contrasts that neurotoxic approach with something entirely different, like diphtheria, which attacks the cellular manufacturing process itself.
Right. Diphtheria is caused by the bacterium Corynebacterium diphtheriae, but the bacteria alone isn't actually what kills you.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the true lethality of diphtheria is actually a result of a viral infection of the bacteria itself.
So a virus infects the bacteria.
Exactly. The bacteria carries a lysogenic bacteriophage, a virus, that has integrated its DNA into the bacterial genome.
That is wild.
That viral DNA contains the tox gene, which instructs the bacteria to manufacture the diphtheria toxin.
The pathogen itself is armed by a virus. That is terrifying. And what does that toxin do once it's released into human tissue?
It acts as an intracellular assassin. Once it penetrates a human cell, it targets a very specific component of the cellular machinery called elongation factor 2.
Elongation factor 2.
To visualize this, imagine the cell's protein synthesis like a massive high-speed rail network delivering vital cargo. Elongation factor 2 is the locomotive engine driving the assembly of amino acid down the track.
So how does the toxin stop the train?
It utilizes a process called ADP ribosylation. It essentially rips a massive, cumbersome molecule off of cellular NAD and violently welds it directly onto the elongation factor 2 locomotive.
It just jams the gears.
It completely jams the wheels. The train instantly derails, and protein synthesis grinds to a permanent halt.
And if a cell can't synthesize proteins, it dies, right? It undergoes rapid necrotic death.
Mass cell death, yeah. In a clinical setting, this cellular wreckage accumulates in the patient's upper respiratory tract, forming a thick, gray, leathery pseudomembrane that can mechanically obstruct the airway and asphyxiate the patient.
Ugh.
Furthermore, the toxin enters the bloodstream, disseminating systemically to attack the heart, causing profound myocarditis and cardiac failure.
This mechanism of aggressive, targeted destruction isn't limited to the respiratory or neurological systems either. If we pull interhemorrhagic E. coli EEC into the frame, we see an entirely different vector of attack.
Targeting the internal plumbing, basically.
Right. The endothelial cells lining the blood vessels and intestines.
EHE is a prime example of an environmental pathogen, often transmitted through agricultural runoff contaminating water or food supplies. When EHEC colonizes the gastrointestinal tract, it produces Shiga toxins.
And those operate on a similar principle to diphtheria, right?
They do. They halt protein synthesis, but they specifically target the vascular endothelium, the delicate cellular lining of your blood vessels.
They shred the lining of the intestines, which results in hemorrhagic colitis. That presents as severe, bloody dysentery. But the Shiga toxins don't stop in the gut.
No, they migrate through the bloodstream and have a high affinity for the cellular receptors in the renal glomeruli.
Which are what exactly?
The microscopic filtering units of the kidneys. The toxins destroy these filters, leading to a cascade of clotting and red blood cell destruction known as hemolytic uremic syndrome, which frequently results in acute, irreversible kidney failure.
Think about the through line here for a second. Whether it's a neurotoxin from a corroded pipe like lead, or a toxin from a pathogen like botulism-cleaving snare proteins, or a hijacked locomotive in protein synthesis, or Shiga toxins shredding the renal filters, the biological system breakdown is identical.
The mechanisms.
Right. The biological system loses its ability to communicate, to synthesize, to filter, to survive. The pipes under a city are basically the external circulatory system of the population. There is no barrier between the civic body and the human body.
None at all.
When you introduce a corrosive element into the external circulatory system, you inevitably poison the internal one.
The boundary is an absolute illusion. The municipal grid and the human bloodstream are two halves of the exact same continuous biological circuit.
Which forces us to look at the engineers of that circuit, doesn't it? We have to examine why this environment was degraded so severely in the first place. Pauli's Flint Fights Back makes a very strong central argument here.
About the democracy crisis.
Yes, that this wasn't an engineering mistake or a chemical oversight or even just bureaucratic incompetence. It was fundamentally a crisis of democracy.
The failure of the passivation layer in the pipes was directly preceded by the intentional dismantling of political representation.
Now, I want to pause here for a crucial moment. Just as a quick reminder for you listening, our sources, particularly Flint Fights Back and our upcoming texts on macroeconomic transitions, contain highly politically charged viewpoints.
Very much so.
They deal heavily with critiques of austerity, neoliberal economics, and state government interventions. As your hosts, we are strictly impartial. We are just reporting on the mechanics of these texts to explain the sociological and historical context as documented by the authors.
Right. We are not taking political sides, nor are we endorsing these specific viewpoints. Our goal is simply to unpack the arguments and the historical record presented in the source material so you can understand the structural forces at play.
Exactly. We're analyzing the political architecture with the same objective lens that we use to analyze the chemical bonds of the orthophosphates. So let's examine that political architecture. The legal mechanism that facilitated the Flint River switch is a framework known as emergency management.
Right. And to understand that, you have to look at the economics. Following the devastating contraction of the domestic auto industry, Flint's tax base was effectively decimated.
The money just left.
It vanished. The city was drowning in structural debt and teetering on the edge of municipal bankruptcy. In response, the state of Michigan deployed a legal framework, initially Public Act 4 and later Public Act 436.
And what did those acts do?
These laws allow the state government to declare a state of financial emergency in municipality and appoint an unelected emergency manager.
And what are the actual boundaries of an emergency manager's authority?
There essentially are none at the local level. The emergency manager assumes the combined powers of both the executive and legislative branches of the city government.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The democratically elected mayor and city council are stripped of their operational authority, and their salaries are often reduced or eliminated entirely. The EM's mandate is ruthlessly singular: enforce fiscal austerity, balance the municipal ledger, and resolve the debt by any means necessary.
The argument presented by Pauli and the activists is that the people of Flint lost their fundamental right to self-governance. The local officials they elected to protect their interests were neutralized, and decisions were now being made by a state appointee whose primary fiduciary duty was to a spreadsheet, not to the homeostasis of the community.
And that prioritization of the ledger over the living community leads us directly to the Carignan Water Authority, or KWA pipeline decision.
Because Flint historically purchased its treated water from Detroit. But Detroit's rates were consistently rising, creating a significant burden on Flint's strained budget.
Concurrently, a new regional infrastructure project, the KWA pipeline, was being constructed to draw raw water directly from Lake Huron.
Okay.
The economic model suggested that breaking away from Detroit and buying into the KWA pipeline would save Flint millions of dollars over the coming decades.
So the emergency manager authorized the decision to sever ties with Detroit and join the KWA. However, Detroit retaliated by issuing a notice of termination for their water contract, meaning Flint would be cut off before the KWA pipeline was physically completed.
They needed a bridge.
They needed a temporary stopgap water source. And rather than negotiating a short-term extension with Detroit, which would have been expensive, the emergency manager authorized the reactivation of the dormant Flint water treatment plant to draw raw water from the Flint River.
Because, purely on paper, Processing their own river water was the cheapest available option to bridge the gap.
It was the lowest cost alternative. But when that decision translated into physical reality and the corrosive water began dissolving the pipes, the response from the state apparatus perfectly highlighted the dangers of severing democratic accountability, didn't it?
Absolutely. The physical evidence of systemic collapse was immediate and highly visible. Residents were pulling brown, opaque water from their taps.
I've seen the photos. It's horrifying.
It smelled strongly of sulfur and raw sewage. When they bathed in it, they broke out in severe, blistering skin rashes. Their hair began falling out in clumps.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though, to ground this in the absolute grim reality of municipal finance. Let's look at the actual numbers Flint was facing. The city's primary revenue source, the auto manufacturing industry, had virtually abandoned the region.
True.
The population had plummeted, leaving a massive, sprawling infrastructure network to be maintained by a fraction of the tax base, many of whom were living below the poverty line.
The math was brutal.
If I am an emergency manager looking at a city completely out of cash, teetering on insolvency, I can't just manifest millions of dollars to pay Detroit's premium rates. Weren't these draconian cuts simply a tragedy of pure mathematical necessity rather than malice? How do you balance a ledger when the money literally does not exist?
The proponents of the emergency manager laws argue exactly that point. They maintain that when a municipality hits terminal insolvency, incredibly painful, deeply unpopular financial decisions are required to stave off total ruin. They argue that local politicians, bound by the desire for re-election, are incapable of making those fatal cuts, necessitating an impartial, unelected manager to amputate the gangrenous financial limbs to save the body of the city.
But the activists in Flint Fights Back argue that the amputation killed the patient.
Precisely. The counterargument is that applying raw austerity to complex biological and physical systems represents a fundamental misunderstanding of reality.
So
When you prioritize short-term fiscal mathematics over the physical homeostasis of a system, you are not saving money. You're merely deferring the cost and multiplying it exponentially.
Oh, I see.
By attempting to save a few $1,000,000 by cutting chemical treatments and switching sources, the state government caused billions of dollars in infrastructural destruction, triggered a lethal infectious disease outbreak, and inflicted incalculable permanent neurological damage on a generation of children.
It is the ultimate catastrophic false economy. And the immediate reaction of the state when the residents trying to show them this failing economy was just flat-out denial.
Total dismissal.
When residents brought bottles of brown, foul-smelling water to public meetings, the MDEQ and state officials dismissed them. They insisted that the water was only, quote-unquote, aesthetically unpleasing, completely gaslighting the population by claiming it was biologically safe to consume, just a little harder than they were used to.
Which brings us to Section 4 of our deep dive. Community resistance, citizen science, and the complex limits of what we define as scientific truth.
Because the official state-sanctioned channels of expertise were actively suppressing the reality of the crisis.
Right. The residents of Flint were forced to generate their own empirical data. They had to bypass the state and fight back with science.
Because the state was aggressively managing the data, weren't they?
Oh, heavily. They used testing loopholes, like instructing residents to pre-flush their pipes running the water for several minutes before taking a sample, which artificially cleared out the particulate lead.
Wow.
This resulted in officially recorded data that showed no emergency. The state spreadsheet said everything was fine.
But the bodies of the residents were telling a very different story. And this is where figures like Leanne Walters become pivotal. She was a mother whose family was experiencing severe, inexplicable health cascades.
Right.
Her son's growth inexplicably halted, his weight dropped, his immune system seemed to crash, and he suffered from severe dermatological issues. She refused to accept the MDEQ's aesthetic dismissals and demanded intensive testing of her own plumbing.
And the results of that test just shattered the state's narrative. To give our listeners context, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, sets a lead action level at 15 parts per billion.
15 parts per billion, okay.
That is the threshold where a municipality is legally required to take corrective action. One of the samples pulled from Leanne Walters' home registered at an unfathomable 13,200 parts per billion.
What? That is insane. It was nearly 1,000 times higher than the federal action level.
Yeah. At 13,200 parts per billion, the water flowing from her kitchen tap easily qualified under federal regulations as hazardous toxic waste.
And Walters didn't just sit on this data. She utilized it as a weapon to breach the bureaucratic stonewalling. She connected with Miguel del Toral, a regulations manager at the EPA.
And Del Toral recognized the catastrophic implications immediately. He authored a scathing internal EPA memo detailing the staggering lead levels at the Walters residence, explicitly noting that Flynn was entirely missing the required orthophosphate corrosion control.
The missing ingredient.
Right. And he warned his superiors that the entire city was likely experiencing a massive system-wide contamination event. But, frustrated by the agonizingly slow and muted response of his own agency, he leaked the memo to Walters.
Which provided the activists with federal validation. And then they escalated the scientific offensive, right? They partnered with Mark Edwards, an environmental engineering professor from Virginia Tech, who had previously blown the whistle on a massive lead contamination crisis in Washington, D.C.
Edwards and his team bypassed the MDEQ entirely. They shipped hundreds of highly sensitive testing kits directly to the residents of Flint.
Citizen science in action.
Exactly. The community organized this massive, meticulously coordinated independent grab sampling campaign. The resulting data proved conclusively that the lead contamination was not an isolated anomaly in a few unlucky homes, but a systemic, catastrophic failure of the entire grid.
And incredibly, the state still attempted to dismiss the Virginia Tech data. They accused the researchers and activists of fanning political flames and causing unnecessary panic. The bureaucratic inertia was so strong that it took a separate vector of data pediatric blood to finally break the dam.
Yes. Dr. Mona Hanna-Atisha, a pediatrician at Hurley Medical Center in Flint, was urged by a colleague to investigate the biological data rather than just the water data.
Smart.
She accessed the hospital's electronic medical records and conducted a rigorous statistical analysis of pediatric blood lead levels before and after the water switch.
Because the water data could be debated or dismissed as sampling errors by politicians, but you cannot argue with the heavy metal concentrations in the blood of infants.
No, you can't.
Hanna-Atisha's study proved that the percentage of children with elevated blood lead levels had doubled across the city, and in the most vulnerable neighborhoods, it had tripled.
Her data was unassailable. It cornered the state government, forcing them to publicly admit the crisis, declare a state of emergency, and immediately switch the water supply back to the treated Detroit system.
But this raises an important question, and this is where the narrative takes a really fascinating and somewhat troubling turn, which Polly explores deeply in Flint Fights Back. We tend to think of these crises as having a neat Hollywood ending, right?
Right. The truth is revealed, the water is switched back, the pipes are fixed, and everyone goes home.
Exactly. But once the immediate acute crisis was acknowledged, the scientific and community consensus fractured drastically over what constituted the truth of the recovery.
The aftermath of a systemic collapse is rarely unified. Once Flint reverted to Detroit water, the state began heavily dosing the system with orthophosphates to artificially rebuild that stripped passivation layer.
Trying to fix it.
Yeah. And Mark Edwards, the Virginia Tech scientist who helped expose the crisis, eventually conducted follow-up testing and publicly declared that the pipes were, quote-unquote, healing.
Healing.
He stated that the lead levels were dropping within federal limits and that as long as residents utilized state-provided point-of-use water filters, the water was biologically safe to consume.
Which, politically, was exactly the narrative the state government desperately needed. They needed a prominent scientific authority to declare the emergency over so they could wind down the incredibly expensive logistics of distributing millions of bottles of water and politically close the book on the disaster.
But the residents who were actually living in the homes completely rejected this narrative.
Because their physical reality did not match Edwards' data.
Exactly. Residents were still pulling their hair out in the shower. They were still breaking out in rashes. They viewed the concept of healing old, damaged lead pipes as a dangerous half measure, a fiscal cop-out designed to avoid the multi-billion-dollar reality of physically excavating and replacing the poisoned infrastructure.
And they brought in opposing scientific experts to challenge the fundamental methodology of how water safety is even quantified. This is where Scott Smith comes into the picture, challenging the entire paradigm of grab sampling.
Edwards and the EPA relied heavily on grab sampling, turning on a tap, filling a plastic bottle, and sending that single liter of water to a lab to be tested for lead.
Okay.
But Scott Smith argued that grab sampling is a fundamentally flawed methodology for assessing human exposure over time.
Why is that?
He introduced a technology called the water bug, which was effectively a biomimetic sponge. Instead of taking a 1-second sample, you place this sponge inside the water flow of a home, in the shower head in the hot water heater and leave it there for days or weeks.
I absolutely love this analogy because it crystallizes the difference in the science. Relying on a single grab sample of water to determine the safety of a home's plumbing is like taking a 1-second blurry snapshot of a 3-hour movie, looking at that single frame and claiming you possess a total understanding of the plot, the character motivations, and the ending.
It's absurd when you put it like that.
You are completely missing the reality of continuous, prolonged exposure.
Exactly. The biomimetic sponges absorbed whatever was passing through the system over time, exactly as a human lung or a human stomach would. And when Smith's sponges were analyzed, they weren't just looking for lead. They found alarmingly high concentrations of disinfection byproducts, or DBPs, most notably chloroform.
Wait, chloroform? How does that even get into the water?
When a city adds heavy amounts of chlorine to disinfect a system that is still loaded with organic matter and bacterial biofilms, the chlorine reacts with that organic material to create DBPs.
Oh, wow.
These are highly volatile chemical compounds. When a resident takes a hot shower, the chloroform aerosolizes in the steam. The resident inhales it, leading to the exact respiratory inflammation, dizziness, and severe dermatological issues the community was still complaining about.
So grab sampling for heavy metals completely misses the inhalation of volatile organic compounds. And what about the physical water filters the state was handing out? Edwards and the state insisted that the filters rendered the water perfectly safe to drink.
But independent microbiological studies, including data analyzed by activists, revealed a terrifying secondary effect. The activated carbon blocks inside those point-of-use filters were incredibly effective at stripping out heavy metals like lead.
That's good.
However, they also stripped out the residual chlorine. So inside the dark, wet housing of the filter itself, you suddenly had a chlorine-free environment.
Oh no, it becomes a microscopic incubator.
Exactly. The filters themselves became colonization sites for opportunistic bacteria, including mycobacteria and potentially Legionella.
In a city that just had an outbreak.
Right. In a city that had just survived a lethal outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, mandating that a population with already compromised immune systems rely on filters that actively bred bacteria was viewed by the community as a massive, ongoing biological threat.
So we arrive at a profoundly unsettling conclusion for Flint. The municipal policy failed, the infrastructure chemistry failed, the biological homeostasis failed, and ultimately even the scientific consensus failed to provide a single unifying truth for the people trapped inside the system.
It's a complete systemic fracture.
And we have to scale this reality out because Flint is not a localized anomaly, is it? It is a blueprint. It is a symptom of a much larger global economic paradigm.
Which serves as the perfect transition into our macroeconomic source, A Just Transition for All, by J. Mijin Jha. We're shifting from the micro-crisis of a single city's collapsing water grid to the macro crisis of the global transition away from fossil fuels.
So what does this all mean? We hear the phrase just transition constantly in environmental and political discourse. It's a total buzzword. But what does it mechanically mean in the context of Jha's research?
Jha outlines that true environmental justice in the modern era requires two distinct, non-negotiable components. First, there must be an actual physical transition away from a carbon-intensive energy economy. We cannot simply build supplemental solar farms and wind turbines while simultaneously continuing to frack natural gas and burn coal at scale.
Yeah.
The industries that are biologically destabilizing the planetary biosphere must be physically decommissioned.
And the second component.
Second, and crucially, the socioeconomic mechanics of that transition must be just.
Meaning we cannot simply flip the switch and plunge millions of energy sector workers into catastrophic poverty in the name of ecological salvation.
Precisely. Because right now, our global economy operates on what Jha defines as an extractive system. The fundamental operating principle of an extractive system is the maximization of corporate profit and shareholder value through the relentless consumption of natural resources and human labor.
With no safety net.
Right, with minimal regard for the long-term homeostasis of the communities hosting the extraction.
Let's ground this in a specific example from the text. The Powder River Basin in Wyoming. This is one of the most prolific coal-producing regions on the planet. The entire socioeconomic architecture of that region is inextricably linked to extracting fossil fuels from the earth.
In regions like the Powder River Basin, coal isn't just an industry. It is the fundamental tax base.
It pays for everything.
It really does. The revenue generated from fossil fuel leases, severance taxes, and royalties literally funds the infrastructure of the state. It builds the roads, it maintains the hospitals, and it provides the vast majority of the funding for every public school district in Wyoming.
So when climate scientists and federal policymakers mandate that we must keep that coal in the ground to prevent a catastrophic rise in global temperatures, state legislatures in these extractive zones fiercely resist. They actively double down on fossil fuel infrastructure.
And they resist because their immediate, localized survival depends on it. If we connect this back to our analysis of Flint, we can observe a horrifying historical parallel. During the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial one, and later from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, the workforce was largely abandoned by capital.
Right, deindustrialization.
Deindustrialization swept through the American Midwest in the late 20th century. General Motors closed its sprawling plants in Flint, evaporating the tax base overnight, which directly precipitated the financial emergency, which triggered the emergency managers, which caused the poisoning of the water supply.
Deindustrialization basically created a sacrifice zone. Flint was stripped of its economic utility and left to collapse in on itself.
And Shaw warns that if we attempt to aggressively mandate a carbon-free economy without establishing a massive preemptive social safety net, we risk weaponizing the energy transition.
Weaponizing it. Wow.
We risk creating 1,000 new Flints across the coal fields of Appalachia and the oil basins of the West. If we shut down the extractive economy without replacing that revenue, those communities will become new sacrifice zones, desperate for capital, starved of municipal resources, and incredibly vulnerable to the exact kind of toxic exposure and infrastructural decay we saw in Michigan.
Jai argues that we must fundamentally re-architect our society from an extractive model to a regenerative one, right?
Yeah.
Our regenerative system prioritizes human health, ecological stability, and community resilience over raw, short-term profit maximization.
Because the biosphere does not recognize the boundary between an economic mandate and ecological collapse. If a town's budget is slashed, the local water pipes corrode and leach heavy metals.
Right.
If a global economy demands relentless carbon extraction, the global climate destabilizes, leading to mass extinction events affecting both wildlife and human populations. It is a single, inextricably linked system.
But I have to push back here again, because this sounds incredibly utopian, and the logistics just seem impossible. If you go to a worker in the Powder River Basin, someone whose mortgage, whose health care, whose ability to feed their children and fund their local school is entirely dependent on driving a coal truck, how do you look that person in the eye and ask them to proactively vote to destroy their own livelihood for a planetary atmospheric benefit they cannot immediately see or feel? It defies every instinct of mammalian survival.
It is the defining geopolitical and sociological challenge of our century.
It's massive.
And the answer provided by the Just Transition framework is that you do not ask them to destroy their economy. You cannot ask a community to martyr itself for the global climate.
Okay, so what do you do?
The state must proactively guarantee their material conditions. You guarantee their pensions, you replace their lost wages, you heavily subsidize and physically construct the new, clean manufacturing industries and the regenerative infrastructure in those exact communities before you shut down the coal mine.
Building the bridge before you burn the boats.
Exactly. You must build the bridge before you burn the boats. Because if you don't build that bridge, they will fight the environmental transition with everything they have. And from their perspective, they're entirely justified. Because a transition without a safety net looks exactly like a death sentence.
Just as the emergency managers forcing unmitigated fiscal austerity on Flint felt like a death sentence to the residents there, you cannot enforce environmental or fiscal health through economic violence. The biological and infrastructural trauma will always cascade down and destroy the very system you're attempting to save.
Exactly.
That is a staggering realization. Let's take a breath and recap the sheer scale of the journey we've been on today. We started by examining the sweeping unilateral power of emergency managers under Michigan law, stripping a city of its democratic voice to balance a spreadsheet. We zoomed into the microscopic level to see how that fiscal decision stripped the chemical passivation layer inside an aging iron pipe, unleashing a cascade of heavy metals. We traced a lead ion as it masqueraded as calcium, hijacking the synaptic channels of a developing brain, and watched as enzymes denatured in corrosive water.
We observed how the degradation of that physical infrastructure triggered a biological crisis, neutralizing chlorine and providing a breeding ground for Legionella.
Yes.
We compare that systemic infiltration to the ruthless mechanisms of botulism cleaving snare proteins and diphtheria derailing cellular protein synthesis.
And finally, we scaled all of that microscopic trauma back up to the macro level, exploring the massive, terrifying challenge of transitioning our global energy economy away from fossil fuels without turning entire regions of the country into deindustrialized sacrifice zones. It has been an incredible deep dive into the absolute interconnectedness of our world.
It all distills down to the realization that the abstract systems we construct, our political frameworks, our economic markets, our municipal budgets, are fundamentally biological systems. They affect living tissue.
They really do.
And as we close, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've talked extensively about how visible infrastructure changes, like switching a municipal water source or decommissioning a massive coal mine, fundamentally alter our biology and our society.
Yeah.
But consider the invisible digital and economic infrastructures you interact with every single day. The algorithms that dictate the flow of information to your screens, the opaque financial instruments that manage your retirement savings, the subtle shifts in local zoning laws.
That's a scary thought.
What invisible passivation layers in your own community or in your own digital life might currently be stripping away without you noticing? What protective barriers are being quietly, methodically eroded in the name of corporate efficiency or fiscal austerity, just waiting to cascade into a sudden systemic crisis?
That is a deeply chilling and absolutely vital question to carry with you. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking hard questions, keep looking beneath the surface of the official narratives, and never, ever take a glass of water or a local policy decision for granted. We will see you next time.